On the 14th of December 1950, 31 miners left their homes in the freezing winter of Pennsylvania to work the night shift deep underground. They kissed their wives and children goodbye, waved to friends, never knowing it would be the last time they would see the light of day. Just hours later, the town of Hazleton was struck by horror when a catastrophic cave-in buried them all. The official report claimed there were no survivors, and the mine entrance was sealed with concrete forever. But the story did not end there. More than half a century later, during the demolition of an old mining office, a hidden passage was discovered, leading down into the sealed levels. There, buried in the darkness, investigators uncovered strange tape recordings, the final desperate cries of men thought to be lost forever. And from those haunting echoes, a terrifying secret, buried for 55 years, slowly began to emerge. Life for a coal miner in the mid-20th century was never easy. In towns like Hazleton, Pennsylvania, the rhythm of daily existence was dictated by the mine. The whistle that blew at dawn and dusk determined when families woke, ate, and rested. For many men, coal was not just a job, it was their inheritance, passed down from fathers and grandfathers who had also worked these dark shafts. To live in Hazleton was to understand that the ground beneath your feet held both livelihood and death in equal measure. The 31 men who descended into Bracken Ridge Mine on that December night in 1950 were ordinary men with extraordinary burdens. Some were young, barely in their 20s, newly married and eager to prove themselves. Others were older, veterans of decades underground, their lungs already heavy from years of inhaling coal dust. They were fathers, brothers, and sons. They were men who laughed together in the taverns on weekends, men who gathered at church on Sundays, men who carried the weight of entire families on their shoulders. For the wives of these miners, life was equally demanding. They tended to small houses, raised children, and stretched every dollar to make ends meet. A miner's paycheck, while steady, was never extravagant, and every cent counted. Women would wait by the window each evening, watching the horizon for the faint glow of their husbands' lanterns returning home. They knew every shift carried risk. A collapse, a gas leak, or an explosion could mean sudden tragedy, and yet the work continued, because there was no other choice. In 1950, the town was already familiar with hardship. Just a few years earlier, mining accidents had claimed the lives of dozens, but the promise of steady employment outweighed the fear. To refuse the mines was to refuse survival itself. So, despite the dangers, the miners of Hazleton pressed on, day after day, night after night, carving deeper into the earth. On the morning before that fateful night shift, the men had gone about their routines like always. Jake Miller, a 42-year-old father of 4, kissed his youngest daughter on the forehead before leaving the house. He had worked in Bracken Ridge for over 20 years, his hands permanently blackened by coal. Another man, Thomas O'Donnell, only 23, had joined the mine just 2 months earlier. His mother worried endlessly, but he had insisted the job was necessary if he ever hoped to save enough to marry his sweetheart. Neighbors recalled seeing groups of miners walking together toward the entrance of the mine that evening, lunch pails in hand, their heavy boots crunching against the snow-covered ground. There was camaraderie among them, a brotherhood forged in hardship. They relied on one another in the suffocating darkness below, where a single mistake could mean death for the entire crew. Inside the mine, conditions were harsh. The air was thick with dust, and the temperature dropped sharply as they descended. The only sources of light were the flickering headlamps attached to their helmets. Every sound echoed ominously, pickaxes striking rock, carts creaking on their tracks, and the distant rumble of earth shifting above. But to the miners, these noises were ordinary, part of the background of their working lives. Danger lurked everywhere, but routine dulled the fear. Still, many of them carried silent dread. Stories of men entombed alive haunted every mining town, yet they tried to push the thoughts away. They joked, they sang, they worked side by side. And in their minds was always the image of their families waiting at home, praying for their safe return. That night, As the clock neared 11 p.m., the men pressed deeper into the tunnels, unaware that the hours ahead would seal their fate. The town above them slept soundly, unaware too, while 31 souls descended into a darkness that would not let them go. For their families, life would change forever. But in that moment before the walls shook, before the silence fell, the miners of Bracken Ridge were simply men, doing what they had always done, stepping into danger, trusting that tomorrow they would once again rise to the surface and breathe the cold Pennsylvania air. At 11:47 p.m., the ground above Bracken Ridge trembled. Families in Hazleton, many already asleep, were jolted awake by the low, thunderous roar that rolled across the valley. Windows rattled, dishes clattered in cupboards, and dogs howled into the cold December night. To the miners below, it began as a distant rumble like thunder muffled through layers of rock. Then, in an instant, the tunnel shook violently. Beams splintered, walls cracked, and a deafening crash echoed through the mine as tons of stone and earth collapsed around them. On the surface, panic spread quickly. The wives of the miners rushed to the mine entrance, clutching their shawls against the winter wind, their faces pale with fear. Smoke and dust poured from the shaft, choking the air. Supervisors shouted orders, while men scrambled to organize a rescue. Within minutes, word traveled through the town. Bracken Ridge had collapsed. 31 men were trapped inside. Rescue efforts began immediately. Crews of volunteers and fellow miners worked through the night, their lamps casting flickering halos in the swirling dust. They dug furiously, desperate to reach their trapped brothers before time ran out. But the mine was vast, and the damage extensive. Entire passages were sealed off, blocked by tons of rock and twisted timbers. The deeper the rescuers went, the more dangerous it became. Another collapse could bury them alive as well. By morning, crowds had gathered at the mine entrance. Mothers clutched children to their sides, their eyes wide with terror. Wives sobbed into handkerchiefs, refusing to leave, even as the hours dragged on. Local officials tried to offer reassurance, promising that everything possible was being done. But as the sun rose higher, the truth grew harder to deny. The miners had not emerged, and their chances of survival were fading fast. Over the following days, the rescue operation became increasingly grim. Drills were brought in to bore through collapsed rock, but each attempt yielded little progress. Small voids were reached, but no signs of life were found. Hopes rose when faint tapping noises were reported deep within the shaft. 3 knocks, then silence. But when rescuers pushed toward the sound, they found nothing but more rubble. Whether those taps were echoes, tricks of the earth, or the dying pleas of the miners themselves would never be known. The official reports painted the disaster as absolute. By the end of the week, rescue leaders concluded that the miners could not have survived. The air supply would have been cut off within hours. Any pockets of breathable oxygen would have been consumed long before. To continue digging, they claimed, was to risk more lives for a cause already lost. The decision was made. The mine would be sealed. Concrete trucks arrived, and under the gray winter sky, workers poured heavy cement into the shaft. Families screamed in protest, begging for one more chance, one more day of digging. Some tried to rush past the guards to the entrance, but they were pulled back, sobbing, as the mine was entombed forever. By the end of December, Bracken Ridge was no longer a place of work, but a tomb of silence. 31 men remained beneath, their bodies never recovered, their stories cut short. Yet, as the years passed, questions lingered. Why had so little been found? No tools, no lanterns, no scraps of clothing. The collapse had been devastating, yes, but even in the worst disasters, rescuers usually uncovered some trace of the men who perished. Here, there was nothing but whispers and shadows. Some locals swore they could still hear faint knocking at night when they walked past the sealed shaft. Others spoke of dreams in which the miners called out, begging not to be forgotten. For the families left behind, grief never fully healed. Widows raised children alone. Sons grew up without fathers. And the name Bracken Ridge became synonymous with sorrow. Each anniversary brought wreaths laid at the old gate, prayers whispered into the wind, and an unshakable sense of unfinished business. The world moved on, but in Hazleton, the mystery remained. 31 men had gone into the mine that night. Not a single one had returned. And for more than 5 decades, their fate was sealed beneath layers of rock and silence, until one day, the past began to stir again. For 55 years, Bracken Ridge remained silent. The mine sat on the edge of Hazleton like a scar, overgrown with weeds and guarded only by rusted fences. To most of the younger generation, it was just an abandoned industrial site, its tragic past reduced to little more than a grim story told by grandparents. But to those who had lost loved ones there, the wound never truly closed. Every December 14th, families still gathered, laying flowers and whispering prayers to the men who never came home. In 2005, a surprising twist of fate brought Bracken Ridge back into the spotlight. The mining company that had long since abandoned the area sold off the property to developers. Old office buildings and storage facilities were scheduled for demolition to make way for new projects. As crews prepared to clear the land, they stumbled upon something unusual. A sub-basement beneath one of the offices, sealed off with thick layers of concrete. It was not listed on any blueprints, and no one could recall its purpose. Curiosity sparked, and investigators were called in to assess the site. Using ground-penetrating radar and drilling equipment, they discovered that this hidden chamber connected to a series of narrow passages leading back toward the collapsed section of the mine. For more than half a century, these passages had been walled off and forgotten. Now, for the first time since 1950, there was a chance to look inside. The reopening of the investigation drew immediate attention. Reporters arrived, eager to cover what many called Hazleton's ghost mine. Families of the lost miners gathered once again. Some skeptical, others hopeful. Could it be possible that answers still lay buried in the darkness? Could something of their fathers, brothers, and husbands finally be brought to light after all these years? When investigators finally broke through the first barrier, they were met with stale air that had been trapped for decades. The smell was faint but unmistakable. Damp earth mixed with something metallic and unsettling. Carefully, the team pressed deeper, their flashlights cutting through the pitch-black tunnels. Dust swirled in the beams of light, and every step echoed ominously in the cavernous silence. What they found shocked them. Amid the rubble and rusted tools were objects no one expected. Old lanterns still blackened with soot, torn pieces of clothing, and even battered lunch pails. It was as though time had frozen in place since that December night. But the most chilling discovery came in the form of a small metal box, locked tight, wedged into the corner of the passage. Inside were several reels of magnetic tape emergency recordings made from a hand-crank radio transmitter. The labels, though faded, still bore dates from the week of the disaster. The discovery electrified the town. The tapes were taken to specialists who carefully restored the fragile recordings. What they revealed was haunting. Crackling voices of miners calling for help, coordinating with each other, and leaving messages in case they did not survive. Some spoke calmly, resigned to their fate, while others betrayed fear and despair. The voices were unmistakably human proof that the men had lived for hours, perhaps even days, after the collapse. For the families, the tapes were both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they provided undeniable evidence that their loved ones had fought to survive. On the other, they confirmed a horrifying truth, that the men had not died instantly, as the official reports had long claimed, but had endured slow, desperate hours in the suffocating dark. Investigators pressed further into the reopened tunnels, searching for more answers. Their flashlights revealed markings scratched into the rock initials, numbers, even phrases etched with pieces of coal. They were messages left by dying men, fragments of hope preserved in stone. Each new discovery deepened the mystery. What else had been hidden here, sealed away for half a century? The reopening of Bracken Ridge was no longer just about history. It was about uncovering a truth that had been deliberately buried, a truth the mine itself seemed determined to keep secret. The deeper investigators pushed into the forgotten tunnels of Bracken Ridge, the more the mind seemed to resist. Narrow passages twisted into darkness, the air grew colder, and strange creaks echoed through the stone as if the mountain itself remembered what had happened there. Each step forward brought new fragments of a story that had been buried for more than half a century, fragments that would soon piece together a truth no one was prepared to face. At first, the discovery seemed ordinary enough: scattered tools, broken lanterns, and splintered wooden supports. But then the team found something more disturbing. In one chamber, half collapsed, lay a cluster of personal belongings: a watch stopped at 12:09, a child's photograph, its edges crumbling, tucked into a rusted lunch pail, a set of boots with the laces tied neatly together, as if the owner had placed them aside in deliberate order. These were not random artifacts, they were traces of men waiting, enduring, and leaving behind silent testimonies of their last hours. As the investigators cataloged these items, their flashlights swept across the walls. What they saw made their blood run cold. Carved into the rock, with coal or sharp tools, were desperate markings, names, initials, dates, and haunting pleas. Still alive, Day 3. No light. Pray for us. One message, scrawled shakily in uneven letters, read simply: "We are not alone." That phrase spread unease among the team. Who had written it, and what had they meant? It suggested something beyond the collapse itself, something else in the darkness. At first, they dismissed it as the delusion of starving, exhausted men. But as they pressed further, the evidence began to challenge that assumption. In a deeper chamber, partially sealed by rockfall, the investigators uncovered human remains. Bones, brittle with age, lay scattered across the ground. Some were arranged in unnatural positions, as though moved after death. Forensic specialists later determined that not all the marks on the bones came from the collapse. Some bore signs of deliberate cutting, sharp grooves consistent with makeshift tools. It suggested a grim reality. In their final days, the miners may have turned to unthinkable measures to survive. But even more chilling was what lay nearby. A small notebook, water-stained and half-burned, had somehow survived. The surviving pages were faint, but enough words could be deciphered to reveal a pattern of despair. The men had rationed food for only a short time. They drank from trickles of water seeping down the walls. As days passed, hunger gnawed at them. The writing grew more frantic, the handwriting weaker. The final legible entry ended abruptly with the words, "We had no choice." The discovery horrified the families. For decades, they had been told their husbands and fathers had perished quickly, mercifully. But now, the truth revealed that the men had lingered, trapped in a suffocating tomb, struggling desperately against starvation. The evidence pointed to a grim possibility: cannibalism, born of sheer desperation. Yet the mystery did not stop there. In the same chamber, etched higher on the wall where few could reach, was a symbol. It was not a name, nor words, but a strange circular mark with jagged lines radiating outward. No one could explain its meaning. Some speculated it was simply the fevered sketch of a dying man, while others wondered if it hinted at something the miners believed they had encountered in the dark. When the tapes recovered earlier were played alongside these findings, the chilling picture became clearer. The last recordings included not only pleas for help, but also strange background. Noises, metallic clanging, distant cries, and once, a voice whispering something that did not match any of the known miners. Audio specialists debated whether it was distortion or something else entirely. But for those listening, the effect was undeniable. It sounded as though the miners were not alone in their final hours. Piece by piece, the secret of Bracken Ridge emerged. These men had not died quickly, as history had claimed. They had endured days of fear, hunger, and unexplainable terror in the black depths of the earth. And their final messages, their carvings, and their bones whispered the same dreadful truth. What happened in that mine was far worse than anyone ever dared to imagine. The fragments of evidence, bones, carvings, tapes, and journals painted a picture almost too dreadful to believe. For decades, Hazleton had mourned the 31 men of Bracken Ridge with a quiet sorrow, convinced they had perished instantly in the collapse. But the truth, unearthed piece by piece in 2005, told a different, darker story. These men had lived on, entombed in darkness, facing choices no human should ever be forced to make. Forensic analysis of the skeletal remains confirmed what the notebook had suggested. Certain bones bore marks consistent with cutting, not from machinery or falling rock, but from deliberate incisions made with sharp tools. Specialists concluded that in their final days, some of the miners had resorted to cannibalism to stave off starvation. It was not uncommon in history stories of shipwrecked sailors and stranded explorers echoed the same grim decisions, but to see it revealed in the bones of fathers, brothers, and sons was almost unbearable. The families were devastated. For more than half a century they had carried the image of their loved ones dying quickly, without prolonged suffering. Now that image was shattered. Instead, they had to face the possibility that their husbands, fathers, and brothers had spent days in agony, descending into hunger, madness, and desperation before finally succumbing. The grief, which had dulled with time, was torn open anew, raw and unbearable. Yet the horror did not end with cannibalism. The recovered recordings offered something even stranger, something harder to explain. When experts cleaned and restored the reels, they revealed long stretches of silence broken by bursts of static and voices. In one recording, a miner's voice, weak but clear, pleaded, "Help us, we are still here." But in the background of that same tape, faint metallic sounds echoed steady, rhythmic, almost like hammering. Investigators initially assumed it was the men striking the walls in distress. But the pattern was odd, not frantic tapping, but measured, deliberate. On another reel, a different voice whispered, "Don't go further, it's there." The tone was panicked, urgent. No one knew who the voice belonged to. It did not match any identified family member or a known miner. Audio specialists suggested it might have been distorted by the failing equipment, the words reshaped by static and interference. But to those who listened, the warning felt chillingly real. The carved phrase discovered on the wall, "We are not alone," took on new weight. Combined with the tapes, it suggested that, in their final days, the miners may have believed something else was in the tunnels with them. Perhaps it was only the product of exhaustion and hallucination, but some investigators argued otherwise. The strange circular symbol carved into the rock, unlike any miner's initials or practical mark, fed speculation. What had they thought they saw? Or worse, what had they heard? For the townspeople, the story grew into something larger than a mining tragedy. Rumors spread that Bracken Ridge had always been dangerous, that tunnels had been abandoned before because of strange noises deep underground. Old men recalled whispers of cursed seams of coal, places where lamps flickered and shadows seemed to move on their own. What had once been dismissed as folklore suddenly seemed more plausible when set against the desperate carvings and chilling recordings of the trapped miners. But beyond the eerie possibilities, one undeniable truth emerged. The miners had been left to die slowly, abandoned by a system that had chosen profit over human life. Records unearthed from the mining company revealed that executives had pushed workers deeper into unstable sections of the mine despite warnings from foremen. Safety inspections had been rushed or ignored altogether. When the collapse came, officials had quickly declared the men dead, perhaps to avoid the expense and liability of prolonged rescue efforts. This revelation outraged the families. Not only had their loved ones endured unimaginable suffering, but their voices had been silenced by the very people meant to protect them. The sealing of the mine had not simply been a tragic necessity. It had been an intentional act to bury both the men and the truth of what had happened to them. The horrifying truth, then, was twofold. On one level, it was the story of desperate men forced into cannibalism, scratching messages into stone, their last days filled with hunger and fear. On another level, it was a story of betrayal. A corporation that chose to seal away living men and erase the evidence of its negligence. And beneath it all lingered the most disturbing question of all. What did the miners mean when they carved, "We are not alone"? No investigation could ever fully answer that. But the echoes of their final hours, preserved in bone, tape, and stone, continued to haunt Hazleton. The Brackenridge miners were no longer just victims of a collapse. They were witnesses to a horror that reached far beyond stone and shadow, a horror that had waited 55 years to be revealed. The chamber was sealed again after the investigation, this time forever. Authorities insisted that no one else should venture into those cursed tunnels. But the town of Hazleton could not so easily forget. For months, whispers ran through the streets about the voices that had been captured on tape, about the strange symbols scorched into the stone walls, and about the possibility that what had happened in 1950 was far more sinister than a simple cave-in. Some locals began to believe the miners had uncovered something buried deep beneath the mountain, something ancient and best left untouched. Others argued it was simply madness born from starvation, fear, and endless darkness. But the fact remained: 31 men had vanished, and not a single body was ever brought to the surface. Only those tapes and fragments of journals survived to tell their final story. For the families, the discovery offered no closure. Instead, it reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Children who had grown up without fathers were now old men themselves, forced to relive the horror of losing them. Widows who had remarried or moved away suddenly found themselves standing once more in the shadow of that December night. Closure never came. Only more questions and more grief. To this day, people who walk near the old mine entrance sometimes claim they hear faint sounds echoing through the rocks. Some say it's just the shifting earth. Others swear it's the muffled ring of a pickaxe or the faint cries of men calling for help from beneath the ground. Perhaps it is nothing more than the imagination of a town haunted by its own past, or perhaps it is something else entirely, an echo that refuses to fade. What happened in Hazleton in 1950 will never be fully explained. The truth, whatever it may be, is buried too deep to ever be brought completely into the light. But the lesson it leaves behind is chillingly clear. The earth holds secrets, and some of them are not meant to be disturbed. And so, as we close this story, remember the faces of those miners, ordinary men who went to work one winter's night and never came home. Their story is not just about mystery or horror, but about the fragility of life, the cruelty of fate, and the unanswered questions that time cannot erase. Some secrets are buried for a reason. Some voices should never be heard again. And sometimes the most terrifying discoveries are the ones that should have stayed hidden in the dark. If you found this story chilling, make sure to subscribe to Last Seen for more haunting mysteries of those who vanished without a trace. Your support helps us bring forgotten stories back into the light.